Shalom is right. El Mishpah Kwamashiala Barakatha. This is the timeline. The timeline's about a beast, which is a nation, who makes war with a people, a special people, a certain people, ever since they were established as a nation by our Creator, Yah. The beast will make an image to worship for all kindreds and tongues and nations that dwell on the earth. The timeline will show who the beast has made war with. Negroes, Africans, Afro-Americans, Native Americans, the Aboriginals, Jews, or Hebrew Israelites, all known by bywords and proverbs. Let's take this walk on the timeline.
Forefathers weren't the pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
Say your coat on the sword, Luke 22 and 36, tell you how deep it gets. You get killed when you mention the truth. Not a fraud, but I get birth to the proof. Cause these words are lying. Haile Selassie, he ain't Christ. It's a lie of Yahweh. Kill the neck. Ain't even dead. My Messiah gon' settle it. Until my brother's locked down by the media. You get your portion of meat in due season. Persecuted like I'm losing my mind. Static at it. I'm like a bomb ticking with time. Shalom. Time keep on ticking.
I also don't believe in drugs. For years, I paid my people extra so they wouldn't do that kind of business. Somebody comes to them and says, I have powders. If you put up $3,000, $4,000 investment, we can make $50,000 distributing. So they can't resist. I want to control it as a business, to keep it respectable. In my city, we would keep the traffic and the dark people, the colored. They're animals anyway, so let them lose their souls.
Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
A former Nixon administration official has admitted that the war on drugs was all about throwing black people in jail. John Ehrlichman, a key player in Watergate and one of Nixon's two top aides, said as much to Harper's Magazine this month. He said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So now that we know that the war on drugs is a total lie, isn't it time to end it?
drugs are menacing our society.
Therefore, it is a part of what I think ought to be our overall mission, which is to give our children a safe, wholesome, constructive upbringing.
Not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Bring them to heel.
We can lift a whole generation away from the grip of a terrible menace. Thanks to the efforts of many people, we now have a rational, coherent, and long-term strategy. Its ultimate success will depend upon the support it receives from every American. From this day forward, let us put partisanship behind us, and let us go forward, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, law enforcement, community leaders, ordinary citizens. Let us roll up our sleeves to roll back this awful tide of violence and reduce crime in our country. We have the tools now. Let us get about the business of using them.
When you see these towns and when you see these thugs being thrown into the back of a wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put somebody in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, the way you put their hand over. Like, don't hit their head, and they've just killed somebody, don't hit their head. I said, you can take the hand away, okay?
Put your hand behind your back. I can't breathe. Get your hand behind your back. If you don't put your hand behind your back, you're going to be gassed. Jim McQuaid is going to be a minister. Here, man. I can't breathe. Put your hand behind your back. We're resisting. Get your hands behind your back, sir. You'll miss everybody. For one, y'all clear. Clear. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Put your hands behind your back. You can get it again. I can't breathe. I gotta do hold you. Please. Please. I gotta do hold you. I'm sorry. Get stuff off of you. Sorry. I'm sorry. No, shit. Can you see him? I'm sorry. Okay. Please. The offender is purposely sit down. He sit down. He's on the floor. Y'all help him up to his feet. At this time, we're going to send this offender into his room. Into his cell. What cell we got over there? Stand up. The time is approximately 16:24. We had a use of force on the offender. What's his name?
Savvy.
What? Savvy. Offender Michael Savvy. And J-Pod. What exactly happened again?
He refused to go to the pod, started walking back towards J-Hawk, don't put my shut the door and we started back.
Shalom Israel. So this video is on the timeline, and we're going to focus on the different bywords and proverbs we've been called over the time. And we're going to start with Fernando and Isabel in 1492, and that would be in Spain. There's a reason why we're going to start there, but before we get to the reason, I believe in every word in the Most High. And this is the perspective that I'm coming from. And the reason why I want to make sure we understand that is because I'm not stating these things because I don't believe that the Bible has been added to. I don't believe that the Bible hasn't been taken away from. And I don't believe that some people haven't tried to diminish the word. But I do believe that the Spirit of the Most High, or His Ruach, is going to lead me into all truth. And since this is what I believe, we got to get some foundation set. We got to get some things established before we can go forward. So when we look at these things, we know for a fact I'm looking at it from the Bible perspective, and this is the world, what is presenting from what the Bible teaches. Now with that, we did look at the war on drugs. And here's a picture of Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton when they were man and wife, first lady and husband of the United States. And Bill Clinton made a thing about saving the children. And at the same time, Hillary Clinton made a statement about making sure the children were brought to hell, that they couldn't do any harm. So we had the war on drugs taking place at that time when he signed what we will call a declaration of war and making sure they used their powers in a way they've never been used before. So we see on that war on drugs that even though they weren't calling them Hebrews or Aboriginals or Judah or Negroes, we know for a fact that they were identifying different people by just the words they were saying. So then as that video went on, we saw different people there attacked. We also see even in the prison when 4 Hebrews were attacked and how they were chained together. And then we seen how the white one wasn't chained. We also seen one Hebrew dying in a shower. And the Geneva Convention even tells about the prisoners of war, how they should be treated. And we definitely see in this hour when Hebrews are locked up, they're not treated in the same manner. They're treated and they can die in their cell. And there is no Constitution of the United States, or there is no law in the United States that stops a Hebrew from being killed. Because if you go back to the 13th Amendment, it tells you that if you're incarcerated, they consider you a slave, and the slave is property. So if you died in the confines of a prison under the Constitution of the United States, that is just and fine. And again, we still see that in this hour. So we went with that first, and now let's get into the timeline.
Latest movie, Django Unchained, and he started talking about the war on drugs, which is an interesting topic to hear Quentin Tarantino talk about, and here are his thoughts.
This whole thing of this war on drugs and the mass incarcerations that have happened pretty much for the last 40 years has just decimated the black male population. It's slavery. It's just slavery through and through, and it's the same fear of the black male that existed back in the 1800s. And there's a reason. Especially having even directed a movie about slavery, and the scenes that we have in the slave town, the slave auction town, where they're moving back and forth. Well, that looks like standing on the top tier of a prison system and watching the things go down. And between the private prisons and the public prisons, and the way prisoners are traded back and forth, and literally all the reasons that they have for keeping this going are all the same reasons they had for keeping slavery going after the whole world had pretty much decided that it was immoral.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Now, we've been at this for a while, so I hope we have built a good foundation for us to go forward with. We used the war on drugs, something that we can relate to. It's not that far back in the past that they used that name, war on drugs, to identify what we will call Hebrews or Aboriginals, Negroes, niggers, whatever you want to call it, to declare a war on them, to put them in captivity, to put them back under what we see the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment says you're still a slave if you're a criminal, no matter how big or small the crime was. So now we want to start at Fernland and Isabella, 1492. And before we can start at that time period with these two, now we're going to travel back in time. We're going to travel back to a period where Rome was in power. That Rome was the mightiest thing going on. And as we travel back in time, here we stopped, and we stop at 430 to 480 roughly AD. And we're looking at the last Roman emperor. And his name is Julius Nepos. And as he was fighting for this rule, he got circumvented or taken his authority from, or conquered, whatever way you want to say it, by Romulus Augustulus. And we can see the money of these two. And these was the last portion of the Roman Empire. The Western Empire was getting conquered. Now the Eastern Empire, and we will touch on this just a little bit later, that survived with their spirit and their edicts and their veins, and as we say, the spirit, because that's what's in this world right now. They kept all those commandments by inquiring in all these different gods and worshiping a false god. And that survived under the Byzantine Empire until around 1453. But now we're looking at all the countries that fell asleep underneath the Roman Empire. So the countries that were ruled under Rome at that time were England, Wales, they were known as Britannia at that time, Spain, and that was called Hispania, France, which was Gaul or Gilly, Greece, Achaia, the Middle East. So when we look at the Middle East, the countries that were included, as we say it nowadays, our term is Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Oman, Palestine territories, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, United Arab Emirates, Yemen. Now, will places like Iran, Iraq, and Israel, most people would know that just to be in the African continent. But for what we're doing right now, as they call it, the Middle East, we want to get a firm foundation of what we're talking about. All these countries that we just read was underneath that umbrella. The next part we look at is the Northern African coastal regions. They were all underneath that Roman umbrella. And in Northern African countries, as we look at those, that'll be Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. So those countries were all under that rule. And the last of that rule took place, as we said, it ended for that Roman Empire, and it ended around 500 AD. Romulus existed, the time frame is 460 to maybe as late as 500, but at that point in time, that's all Roman Empire. That's all anyone known. Now we see the image of the American flag waving back and forth. And America existed from 1619 to 2019 is what we're speaking of today. And that's 400 years. If we look at from 460 to 711 AD, when we go to the Moors and authority, that's a time period where the Romans no longer existed as the rulers of that land. So we want to take that into account, because when we start talking about the Moors, when we pick up from 711 AD to 1492, that's even a longer period. But at this point in time, money is changing. No longer we have, like we see with Romulus and Nippus, their money, all that stuff is passing by the white side. All these countries are now making their own laws, statutes, and commandments from this period right here. Now we're going to look at the Moors. Now we're about to put a face with the crime, sort of, because we know what Europe and different countries feel about those of color. And let's look at 711 AD. And we're looking at the Moors in Pacific. So Europe occupation by the Moors began in 711 AD, when the African army under the leader Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar from northern Africa and invaded the Iberian Peninsula at Datus. All of Europe and all different parts of where we said the Roman Empire existed is now under the rule of all the images of the people and things you've seen going by from 711 AD all the way up to 1492 AD. And this brings the end of the Roman Empire for almost 1,000 years until it comes back. And now we're going to give scripture on that, but we're going to continue with the Moors so we can have a thorough understanding of what we're talking about. So in some cases, we'll know that Hebrews were identified to look like the Moors. So now we're going to get witnesses of what the Moors look like. 1492, it says Europe is free. Bourdili, the black Muslim general and ruler of Granada City, is defeated after a besiegement of 8 months by Christians' armies. And now we're going to go to the descriptions of what these people said the Moors look like. There's a book, and the book is The Song of Roland. And this is what it reads. Here is an excerpt of the Song of Roland, a French epic tale of the battle between the Franks and the Africans in northern Spain in the 8th century, which tells us about the invaders' appearance. At their head rise the Second Abysm. No worse criminal rise than that the company strained with the marks of his crimes and the great treasons, lacking the faith in God, St. Mary's son, and he is black as melted pitch. Ethiopia, burned faces of Africa and ancient Greek, a cursed land indeed. The black Moors from there are his keep, broad in the nose. They are flat in the air. 50,000 more in company when Roland sees the unbelievable race. Those hordes and hordes blacker than the blackest ink. No shred of white on them except their teeth. So we got eyewitness accounts out of books. But now we're going to go down to an eyewitness account of the King of Spain at the time. And his name was Alfonso X. And this is what he says. Spanish King Alfonso X, called the Wise, gave an account of the invasion. All the Moorish soldiers were dressed with silk and black wool that had been forcibly acquired. Their black faces were like pitch, and the most handsome of them was like black as a cooking pan. The Moors under African Arab command took over to southern France before being repelled at Portus by Charlemagne's grandfather. They fell back in Spain, Portugal, Sicily, that they literally re-civilized for more than 7 centuries. So, 7 centuries, we have, as they like to call them, these black devils that were ruling over them. And again, we'll see some of the names. Like when the 13 colonies came here, they made a treaty with the Moors. Well, use that document. We'll also see when Christopher Columbus was sent out, he had Hebrew translators with him because the Moors actually took some Hebrews with them. And they looked like that. Some of the Aboriginals, they got confused with Moors as well. So we got this thing is identified now. So we got our description. We got eyewitnesses. So we're going to look at this last thing before we pick up with our next part on the Moorish civilization. So in 1492, Europe is free. Bourdili, the black Muslim general and ruler of Granada City, is defeated after the besiegement of 8 months by the Christian armies. Consequently, the last Moorish bastion falls, and some 3.5 million blacks living in Spain and Portugal fall back to Africa or disperse throughout Europe. And this is what we're going to concentrate on. This is what we're going to pick up with Ferdinand and Isabella and their edicts and the Pope edicts. And we're going to see exactly who they're talking about or who they're making war with and when they go dispersed throughout all these nations. All right. All praise to the Most High. Let's continue with this lesson. Let's pick up at 1492 with Roland and Isabel and the re-emergence of the Roman Catholic Empire. All praises to the Most High, the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So before we get too deep into Ferdinand and Isabel, we're going to say, what thus saith our Elohim, or what thus saith Yah. So we're going to go directly to the book of Revelations. We're going to Revelations chapter 13, verse 1. Revelations chapter 13, verse 1, and it reads, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy." So, with that, we're going to stop right there. And before we can go any further, we need understanding. And if we need understanding to understand the book of Revelations, we are going to go to the book of Daniel, because Daniel is going to explain what a beast is. A beast is not this. And you see a whole bunch of heathens with their designs, with their configurations, what they believe the book of Revelation is, because they'll see this animal, that animal, they'll throw everything together, and it is all wrong. So for us to get understanding, we're going to make up a glossary. We're going to show what an image of a beast is, and a representation of the animals thereof out of it. And to make sure that we're on point, we're going to go to the book of Daniel, and he will explain all those things for us in detail so we can't be confused. Then we're going to come back to the book of Revelations and just read about 9 verses. And then we're going to proceed from 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, and then the Pope and all the images and all this stuff takes place after that fact. So all praises to the Most High. Let's get this thing started. This will be the reading for Daniel chapter 7, so we can get understanding before we go to the book of Revelation. How we will read the book of Daniel: we will read verses 1 through 3 in chapter 7. Then we're going to skip down and read verses 15 through 25. He will explain the nature of his dream. Then we'll go back to 4 and 14 with the explanations in hand and make sure we have understanding with that. With that being said, here is the read of the book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and a vision of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and beheld the 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. Skipping down the Daniel chapter 7, verse 15, and it reads, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto one of them that stood by, and asked him the truth of all these. So he told me, and made me known the interpretation of the things. These great beasts, which are 4 kings, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever and ever, forever and ever. Then I would know the truth of the four beasts, which were diverse from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devour and break in pieces, and stamp the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes, and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows, I beheld, and that same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High. And the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4 beasts shall be 4 kingdoms upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all the kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down, and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hands until a time and a times and the dividing of times. So that was Daniel 7. Now we're going to get the proper interpretation thereof. So what we learn from Daniel chapter 7, reading verse 15 through 25, the first word we want for our glossary is beast. And when we see that in Revelations 12, Revelations 13, as well as Daniel 7, a beast represents a nation, a powerful nation that comes out of the earth. The next word we learned for our glossary, for our education, was horn. And the representation of a big horn or little horn is a king or a spokesperson of authority speaking on behalf of a nation. So we see right now the images of all these nations and powers that arise in the earth from way back in the beginning of time until what we see our time ending right now. And we understand our beast nation is something that will exist until the Most High comes back per the word. Let's continue. Now, we got a glossary for beasts. Now we're going to do a quick image of the horn. And when we look at this video coming up, when we look at our glossary, we know exactly what a beast is. Now we want to know exactly what the horn is. Now with the horn, we could go to Mussolini, we can go to Arafat, we can go to one of the presidents of the United States, we can actually go to Young Jong Kim, but for this purpose, we're going to look at Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler. And so when you have a big horn or little horn, it depends on how much might they have, how much power. We can see how vast Germany spread, how much military might that it had. And most importantly, we're going to look at Hitler himself speaking great words. Now, when they work for that beast that we're talking about, they'll be speaking the words that that beast nation gives them with full authority. They'll be speaking its words. So that's the image that we see of the horn. Now we will proceed with more information of what happened in 1492 with the revived Roman Empire and who they went to make war with. All praise to the Most High. We in the midst of this video now, and I'm going to tell you the truth. It feels good. It really does. So now we traveling back in time. We have traveled back to 1478. And we're going to pick up at Ferdinand and Isabel. And the reason why we travel back to this time is they make the Spanish Inquisition at the time. And the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 is called the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, commonly known as the Spanish Inquisition. Was established in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabel I of Castile. So, with this Spanish Inquisition, this establishment of 1478, what took place at that day in that time still, as they would say, reverberates, still takes place, still is in the earth at this very day with all different countries from the far east to the far west to this very day. See, they made a pledge to revive the Roman Catholic authority, to revive Rome, and they did what they promised to. So they pledged. She had on her black dress or her black veil. They went from the Pope, and the Pope gave them all authority to carry out their his edicts and their laws for the Rome as a nation. Now, these are called the Aragonese laws or Aragonese laws. And the Aragonese laws are Aragon is anonymously a community in Spain, coexistence with the medieval kingdom of Aragon. According to the Aragonese laws, the monarchs had to swear allegiance to the kingdom's laws being accepted as the king. So this is what they did in 1478. They swore allegiance, and nowadays we'll see all these different, as we see images going by right now, all these presidents, kings, Arabs, whatever want to give them a title to, kissing the ring, being in front of the Pope, bowing down to that authority. Now, it even goes further because as we look in our word, as we say, the inspired word of the Most High, we'll look at the Bible and we'll understand, take Genesis 3:7. It says, then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. See, the Most High end up covering Adam and Eve's nakedness because of their sin. Ezekiel 16:8, then I passed by you and saw you, and behold, you were at the time for love. So I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. I also swore to you to enter into the covenant with you, so that you became mine, declares Yah. So the covering happens between the Most High, the man, and the woman. And that's really explained well in 1 Corinthians 11:5-15. It tells you that a woman can dishonor her head if she's not covering, prophesying for the Most High. The man is the covering for the woman. But now we look at these images. The Pope is the covering for these kingdoms, and we can see all these different women covered and adorned in black and a veil over them as the edicts that took place underneath the Aragonese laws. The same way Isabella did it back then, we still see those same things going on right now. So this brings us up to, again, as we look at the timeline, up to 1492. Because they made this pledge in 1478. And they're fighting to get rid of the Moors and anybody that doesn't go underneath the Catholic umbrella. So they end up winning because they win the War of Granada. And as they win the War of Granada and defeat the Moors, now we see the Alhambra Decree. And the Alhambra Decree is also known as the Edict of Expulsion. And what happens at the Edict of Expulsion? This takes place on the 31st of March, 1492, by the joint Catholic monarchs of Spain, Isabel Castilla, and Ferdinand II of Aragon, ordering the expulsion of practicing Jews from the kingdom of Castile and Aragon and territories possessed. And they had to get the hell out by July 31st of that year. And we can go in detail how wicked that was, because they even changed laws to make some people slaves so they couldn't get out. But all praises to the Most High. What we're looking at is this edict and what took place and who this edict was made against. So we know they beat the hell out the Moors, and now they're also focusing on the quote-unquote Judah, or what they call in slang Jews, to make sure they're all getting out the country, and if not getting out the country, they're bowing down to that edict that they're making from Isabel and Fernando. And at the very first of that edict, when it takes place in July 31st, you got anywhere from 2,000 Jews that converted to 100,000 that got expelled. And we're not talking about how many had to get killed on that very first day. So that's what happened there. Now we're going to look at writings of historians that give an accurate account, a visual account of who this edict of expulsion was directed to, what was the color of them people, what did they look like, and who did they call Jews. So all praises. We saw who they said looked like the Moors. Now we're going to see who looked like the Jews. And this is in 1492, way before the slave trade. And 3 million of the Moors fled from Europe when they got defeated, and they took some of the Hebrews with them. We're going to start seeing when they went from different points of the world before the actual slave trade took place, and then we'll see some of their names too. But let's read on what the Hebrews looked back at that time during this edict of expulsion. Now, at this point of the video, we're going to identify exactly who the people were by historians and eyewitnesses of who the Edict of Expulsion or the Alhambra Decree was against. We're going to look at the identity of those people. Now, when we use the word Jews, we're going to use, of course, what the Bible says. The Bible says that all these nations were confederate against the Jews. With one accord, they going to make war with these people off of what the beast has said. And this war, or this fight against the Jews, this will not end until the Most High comes back. That means they're not going to make any treaties with them. They're not going to identify them, who they are. They're not going to do anything to help comfort them. You may have pockets of heathens that may help the Jews, but as these nations, they're going to try to keep their foot on their throat all the way till the Most High comes back. With that being said, the first book we're going to look at to identify who the Jews were talked about during the Edict of Expulsion, we're going to look at a book named The Negro in the New World by Harry Johnston. And this book was first published in 1910. The book is outstanding. And what some people said, if you're a historian and you want to know about different people of the world and what's happened and what took place and what governed the Jews and them time frames, this is a must read. Now, this book is going to talk about the Bantu Negro, the Brazilian Negro, And it's going to be dealing with these people at that time. Not what we're talking about modern day, but going back all the way to the 1800s. And they got a whole bunch of pictures to go along with what they're talking about. When the Dutch had the Negro in slavery, the East Indian Negro, the Cuban Negro, and some of these images that you look at, the quote unquote Negroes will even look like as what some people call the Indians or Aboriginals as well. This book will not stop. It was also going to talk about the British colonies and their quote unquote Negro system they had, slave ships. And again, like Psalm 83 said, all these nations have to be confederate against Judah, or what we call the Jews. It goes to the Negroes that were in Jamaica, St. Thomas, the Bantu, so on and so forth. We're going to go to their explanation of what the Jews look like, and we're going to turn to this book, The Negro in the New World, and we're going to go to page 27. The book you can find online, and one of the best places that you can read this book is at https://archive.org, details Negro in a New World, and you can skim through the images as well as read the book. But we're going to page 27. In this page, this is what the caption reads about the Jews at that time. And it reads, the Jews are composed of 3 or 4 separate racial elements. The Asiatic Negroid strain shows itself occasionally in the curly hair, the long eye, and the proportions of the skull. The Jewish hybrids with the Negro in Jamaica, Ghana reproduce most strikingly in Assyrian type. It is quite conceivable that the great peninsula of Arabia was once populated, as far as its natural conditions allowed, by a primitive Negro stock, which may have been later or partially exterminated by the changing and unfavorable conditions of climate and by the aftercoming in the white man and his types. So that's their take on what the Jews were back in that time. We're going back from the Edict of Expulsion. Now we're going to look at another source that identified what the Negroes looked like during the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, Hebrews. So we're looking to identify who the Edict of Expulsion was against, or who we call the Spanish Inquisition. At this point, we're going to our next source. And in this source, they also going to give us a description of what, and this is their words they use, Jews and Hebrew. And the book we're going to go to is on the classification and graphical distribution of the mammal. And a mammal is mammals. Anything with fur and hair has to produce milk, and they also include gorillas. This book continues to say, a lecture on Sir Robert Reed's Foundation, delivered at the University of Cambridge in the Senate House, May 10th, 1859. So this is the source we go into, and all the senators and governors and presidents of the United States that listen to this thing and understand the sources, and just like we got one senator that called the Hebrews or blacks the Aboriginals and one of the things, all of them got this from this one source way back in 1859. Now we're going to go read what this gentleman said in reference to what the Jews look like. Before we do that, let me give you the location where you can find this book at. https://archive.org. Details on the classification. And you can see this link on your page right now in the description. Now we're going to turn to page 96. And he's starting to talk off of gorillas and jaws, and he's giving an explanation on different colors and things that happen in regions. And then he gives it down to the explanation of how they could trace Jews and how they haven't mixed with too many other races they kept to themselves. So let's go to the last paragraph down here, page 96. And it reads, with reference to characteristics of color, which are extreme, we have now opportunities of knowing how much that the character is the result of the influence of climate. We know it more particularly by the most valuable mode of testing, such influences which we derive from particularly of the Jewish race. For 1800 years, that race has been dispersed in different latitudes and climates, and they have preserved themselves distinct from intermixture with other races of mankind. There are some Jews still lingering in the valleys of the Jordan, having been oppressed by the successive conquerors of Syria for ages, of low race of people, and described by trustworthy travelers as being as black as any of the Ethiopian races. Others of the Jewish people participating in European civilization and dwelling in the northern nations show instances of the light complexion, the blue eyes, light hair of the Scandinavian families. The condition of the Hebrews since their dispersion has not been such as to admit of much admixture by the proselytism of the household slaves. We are thus led to the account for their differences in color by the influence of climate without having to refer them to the original or specific distinctions. So that's what they wrote down. They continue to equate mankind with, they see different dog sizes and why you see different man sizes. They're on therefore. So you'll get people nowadays, if we say we're a Hebrew Israelite, they'll tell you that Hebrew is just a nationality. But the person that did this lecture, the United States government, did not see people as Hebrews or people that just of a tongue or a dialect. He also compared Hebrews or Jews as being as black as any of the Ethiopian races. So here we see across our screen Ethiopian races. That does not look like any of the people that's in the land today. He also, furthermore, equates the Jews and Hebrews to the slaves, of the household slaves that were at that time in America. So we see them equating the household slaves to the Jews and the Hebrews at that time, as well as Ethiopians. So this was delivered to the Senate House at Cambridge, and that's what America knew at that time. So let's continue with another source. So we're at the point in the video where we're going to use our last source to identify what the Hebrews look like. And again, if you know me, the last source is going to be referenced towards the Bible. But for those that at this point in the video love some of the information and want to keep going on to find out different sources of what the Hebrews look like at the time of our Messiah, at the time of 100 AD, and so on and so forth. You can look at this Hebrew brother who's doing a lot of good work, Benaiah, Israel, and he's got a whole list of videos up. Again, Benaiah, Israel. That's where you can find him on YouTube. Some of his videos are the Hidden Hebrews, called The Black Hebrew Israelite, The True Color Revealed, The Black Hebrew Inquisition. So these are some of his videos that you can find. Another brother that's doing some good work. And if you want to continue on the identity of the Hebrews and focusing on that. Another brother by that name is Ron Dalton, and you can see both of their pictures and their names up on the screen right now. But we're going to continue with the timeline, and with the timeline, we're going to trace back to all these bywords and proverbs that we called and figure out exactly what that is and who these people are hunting us down. Let's continue with our last source. And our last source, again, is going to be the Bible, but we're going to use this Roman historian, equated with being one of the most accurate Roman historians they are. And the name of the Roman historian we're talking about, his name is Publius Cornelius Tacitus. And he lived from 56 AD to 120 AD. And Tacitus was quoted as a credible source of history. We're going to read from one in particular and then move on. But Tacitus wrote on when the Rome invaded Britain. That was one of his first works he wrote. He also wrote on what it was to be a German and how the Romans shouldn't let the Germans rise up to power. He wrote on the histories, and that's the book we're going to quote from. And he wrote more than one book. There's volumes of the book, and we're going to quote from volume 5. And the last one he wrote is the Annals. And the Annals, again, if you want to go in that direction, the Roman historian and senator Tacitus referred to our Messiah, Yahushua HaMashiach, his execution by Pontius Pilate, and the existence of who the Romans called early Christians in his final work, the Annals. And that was written roughly around 116 AD. That's book 15, chapter 44. So again, he is not a quote-unquote Christian. He wasn't a Hebrew. He was just living at that time because our Messiah was crucified around 30 AD. He was born about 20 years later. Lived in the same area, same time. Lived and existed the same time as Shaul, or who we call Paul. And again, in his book 15, chapter 44, he talks about all the stuff he knew firsthand about our Messiah being killed. That being said, we are now going to look at our writing of Tacitus, and this comes from the Histories, volume 5 or book 5, 2 through 5, or page 5, 2 through 5, and it reads, a few authorities hold that in the reign of Isis, the surplus population of Egypt was evacuated to the neighboring lands under the leadership of Hieronymus and Judas. Many assure us that the Jews are descendants from those Ethiopians who were driven by fear and hatred to immigrate from their home country when Cepheus was king. There are some who say that the motley collection of landless Assyrians occupied a part of Egypt and then built cities of their own, inhabiting the lands of the Hebrews and the near parts of Syria. So this is our last source. And again, refer back to us as Ethiopians, called us by Hebrews, called us Judah, and that's where we get the slang word Jews. Now we're going straight to the word of the Most High. So we hear two of us, or the sources, quote that we are Ethiopians. And let's see where they're getting that from. The first book we're quoting from, Amos chapter 9, verse 7. Amos chapter 9, verse 7, and it reads, are ye not as children of the Ethiopians unto me, O children of Israel? Saith Yah, have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Captor, and the Syrians from Ker? Continuing, now we're looking at Acts chapter 21, verse 38. And this is what they said Shaul looked like, through 39. Acts 21, verse 37 through 39, and it reads, As they were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, May I say something to you? Do you speak Greek? He replied, Aren't you the Egyptian who cited a rebellion some time ago and led 4,000 members of the Assyrians into the wilderness? But Paul answered, I am a Jew from Taurus in Sicily, a citizen of no ordinary city. Now I beg you to allow me to speak to the people. So again, going back with Tacitus, and the reason why we cited him, the images going across your screen is some of the Sudanese, some of the ones in the book of the histories who say the ancient Egyptians look like these people. So again, when they referred to him looking like the Egyptian, they're referring to him to look like these people that you see on your screen right now. And that goes back to a source going from 60 AD to 120 AD, his life time going back as far as we can. So that's what the Egyptians looked like to them back at that time, not what Charlton Heston looked like in the movies. Last source in the Bible, we're going to do the book of Acts again. And we're looking at Acts 13, verse 1. We're just going to read this one verse, and this reads, Now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, as Barnabas and Simeon, that was called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene and Manaen, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So here we see Barnabas and Simon. They were called Niger. Niger is the same word the Portuguese used during the transatlantic slave trade, and they refer to us as Niger. Those are the ones we call Jews or Judah. So you got a lot of people that don't want to conform to that. But again, this is the timeline. And now we're going to continue with the 6th Pope and his making of the image of the beast for us to worship. And anybody did not bow down to the image of the beast caught pure D hell. And we will trace that back to see if that is true as well. All right, let's continue with the timeline.
To the Most High's only begotten Son.
Yeah. I'm going, hey, watch me go get cigarettes. Watch me go get cigarettes. I'm going, hey, watch me go get cigarettes. Watch me go get cigarettes. I'm going, hey, watch me go get cigarettes. All that. Look.
Here we go again. Because the word of Yah's the Bible, and like my father Abraham, you know I'm at war with all your idols. It will be blood up to the horse's bridle, bridle. For everyone who bowed and worship idols, idols. Yeah. The kingdom of heaven's at hand. These golden temples is built with the hands of man. Nobody will revenge. It will be blood up to the horse's bridle, bridle. For everyone who bowed and worship idols, idols. Yeah. The kingdom of heaven's at hand. These golden temples is built with the hands of man. Nobody will revenge. Yellow on the way to the promised land.
Don't. Stop. Don't worry about it.
The book of Acts, chapter 5, verse 30. The Elohim of our fathers raised up Yahshua, whom ye slew and hanged on a tree. Acts chapter 10, verse 39. and we are witnesses of all things which he did both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Acts 13, verse 29. And when they had fulfilled all that was written of him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a sepulchre. 1 Peter 2, verse 24. Who his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sins, shall live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. The Messiah hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is every one that hangeth on a tree. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 22 and 23. And if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day. For he that is hanged is accursed of Elohim. Now, tell me where you got a cross from. Okay, Hebrews, we are coming down the downslope. Now we're going to transport ourselves back in time. We're going way back again. 1493 to be exact. Going back to Pope VI. And the reason why we stop here in 1493, we're going to stop here at this time, and this will take us all the way up to the 1600s. This is the part of time where the lies become truths, the truths become lies, things become extorted. The picture does not become very plain like a looking glass, because there are those that are out there that want to pervert the truth. The same way this video will be posted in 1 week, and YouTube will try to take it down the very next week. See, these things, we are looking to discover the truth and dispel the rumors and the lies. So we're going to go through all that. But yes, we are now back at the time of 1493, and we are looking at what is taking place in the world at that time. The first person we're going to look at is, of course, the Pope. And we're looking at Pope VI. Was a Borgia, but is now the Pope. And he is the foundation of all these popes that came after him. All this wickedness, and they don't want to turn back in their homosexualities, all the little twisted things they have, the idolatry, but also the hate they have for the Hebrew Israelites. Not the fake ones that convert, but the ones according to the flesh. See, in 1493, the Pope issued a decree, as they call a papal bull. And the decree that he initiated was the Inter Carte, in which he authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and the native people as subjects. This decree asserted the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, enslave everyone that didn't bow down to their false images, then fall down to the Catherine doctrine. See, that's why you'll get people say the Bible reads this and we can't get with it because other people are doing that. And they used to do that under that Catholic umbrella under the penalty of death. As long as we live, some will never be able to break that stronghold. Now, with that doctrine that came out at 1493, we see in the year 1494 the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, the Treaty of Tordesillas, we see that was Spain and Portugal dividing the New World up as bounty. You know, you take this, we take that, and that way they will stop the fighting. It had nothing to do with were we raping, murdering, killing, and doing things of a wicked nature. Maybe we should not be doing it. They wanted to know how they could keep the party going. And some of this you could read in the book called The Lines of Demarcation of the Pope, Alexander VI, in the Treaty of Tordesillas, AD 1493 and 1494. Now we're going to look at some of the images that came across as that white Jesus. And you'll get some say that's Caesar Borgia, and some say it was created by Leonardo da Vinci. The only problem you have with that is Leonardo da Vinci, the Jesus that he created, he actually made in his own image. Again, you can see the picture on your screen. Now, some of the people will point to a French writer, Alexander Dumas, as well as others, that said this likeness and model of the Messiah was made after Caesar Borgia. Alexander Dumas, he actually lived around the 1800s. 300 years after, we will say, Leonardo da Vinci painted his pictures. So this is not truly a first-hand account, but he was around a lot sooner than the points that we're talking about in the 2000s. Alexander Dumas, he was half Hebrew, half heathen, or what they like to call a mulatto. His daddy was a French nobleman. His mama was a 14-year-old girl, a Hebrew slave. Responsible for some of the books and movies that we like The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers. Alexander Dumas also wrote things about the Borgias, Volume 1, Volume 12, so on and so forth. And again, anybody could post a link or a book in here. They could make this true or make it false. I've never seen anything written from Alexander Dumas firsthand in any of his books that says that painting was after Caesar Borgia. You'll get people that point to him saying that's where it comes from. I think it really just comes from, as we look at the time and the looking glass and all those things, that false image arise, and that false image got a lot to do with our captivity or our disbeliefs and not returning back to our Messiah, because we got that false image that's blocking us. So again, as we continue, and again, you can see on your screen Leonardo da Vinci and the sixth Pope and his son Caesar Borgia. We can see the time frame they lived in, but we also see the image of the Messiah that he created. Actually looks more like him. And then we look at all these other images of Caesar Borgia with the other messiahs, and they come a lot later. We also see that the Roman Empire dabbled in making a white messiah going all the way back to 400 AD, but it actually stuck and kept to the 1500s when they chased down Hebrews, Aboriginals, and Indians for them to worship that false messiah. And again, part of that book that people like to claim is Volume 1 of Dumas' celebrated crime, The Borgias. But again, I can't find anything in that book that says that Caesar Borgia was done after him. Now, these are all the people that came to the New World, and we're going to get in some documentation of this. You have Christopher Columbus, Herman Cortez, Ponce de Leon. These are some of the guys that came to the Americas, that came to conquer, put that yoke of iron on them. Here we're going to look at a couple of translators that actually went with Christopher Columbus. The first one is Luis de Torres. And Mr. Luis de Torres, he was a Hebrew translator. And again, this is a documented fact that was with Christopher Columbus when he came to the Americas and these different islands. And he only hung out with them for about a couple of years until he passed on. We can see him written about in this book we're going to look at now, The Lost Tribes of the Promised Land. And the Lost Tribes of the Promised Land, and this book was written by Ronald Saunders. And the original published date of this book is 1978. At this point of this lesson, or this history that we're teaching, we're going to look back at how the Hebrews became Indians, Aboriginals, and took on all these different names. And we're going to use this book and some of the people that went out with Christopher Columbus to show you how they identified them. So the first page we're going to go to in the Lost Tribes of the Promised Land is page 92. All right, so we're at page 92. And page 92, the name of this chapter is Columbus' Golden World. And if you want to find this book that I'm quoting from, you can go to www.Lost Tribes of the Promised Land and type in the PDF and you'll get the book. We're going to skip down to the second paragraph, and it reads, "We do not know much concerning Columbus' crew of about 90 men on board the 3 ships, but at least one of them was an Israelite, whose presence as such was not merely accidental. This was Luis de Torres, a convert of possibly only that year, who was once held a position with a governor of Marcia. He was said to have known Hebrew, Aramaic, and some Arabic, and had been brought along by Columbus specifically as an interpreter." So they brought Hebrew interpreters along directly after they conquered the Moors and chased the Hebrews and the Moors out of that portion of Europe. And then we see the decrees and the laws that were made to say, we want to keep these people enslaved forever. One reason, we don't want to have the same outcome we had when we had to fight them, we lost for almost 1,000 years. The next reason was our God-given right, and how this kingdom was different from all the other kingdoms they had. They were going to actually use the word of the Most High in the Bible to put these things in place and have all these other countries sign off of it and be in one accord with it. Now, we're not done with this book. We're going to skip down to page 364. We're at the Lost Tribes of the Promised Land, page 364. And we're going to read a little bit more of this. The reason why is we're going to get a good backdrop on what they're talking about. Let's read 364, Lost Tribes of the Promised Land. And it reads, "Among the New World Morenos, blessed be the name of the Lord, who has not made me an idolater, a barbarian, a Negro, an Indian." When they suddenly be stopped, those Indians, he told himself they are Hebrews. Pondering this thought incredulously, And yet with growing conviction, he resolved that if he ever was released, he would seek out the Indian Francisco and try to learn the truth. Montezino's story unclear, as the circumstances of his incarceration is equally unclear as to those of his release. But released he was. And he immediately went to Francisco, revealing himself as a Jew. Montesinos proclaimed his conviction that Francisco hidden people were of the same race as he. Would Francisco lead him to them? The two men were soon back in the rugged mountains in which Francisco had made his initial revelation, marching relentlessly for a week before they finally came to a halt. It was a Saturday. Montesino makes a point of telling us, and they had come to a river larger than the Dorero. Are three echoes of the Sapitanian in all of these. Here, Francisco announced is where your brothers will be seen, waving a banner high in the air. The Indian guide soon was greeted by a puff of smoke far beyond the other bank of the river. In response to his signal, the two men waited. Eventually, a canoe appeared, bearing 3 men and a woman, all of them Indians, to the place where Francisco and Montesinos were standing at the water's edge. The woman got off and spoke to Francisco in an Indian tongue that Montesino could not understand, although he could perceive that he was being identified in a conversation. She then turned to her male companions to explain the situation. Upon hearing her words, they rose, went over to Montesino, and to his utter astonishment said, Shema Israel, Adonai Elohim Adonai Ehad. And translated, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. They had recited in Hebrew the fundamental creed of Judaism. So, quick insert. Now, why is this important that they wanted to pick out the day Saturday? See, that is called the Sabbath day. And if you kept any of the Hebrew customs, Shema Israel is what we sing to the Most High on the Sabbath day. Now, don't take my word from it. Let's look at Shema Israel being sung. Selah. In Hebrew, Selah means to think about that. So I want you to think about this. Under the Constitution of the United States, under the Black Code laws of the United States, under the Jim Crow laws of the United States, it was illegal for 2 or 3 blacks, 4 or 5 blacks to congregate together. You couldn't come from one town or one space, sit down and chop the breeze. So, in the same context that I'm telling you this, it is not because we could just sit there and conversate and they didn't want to see us having a good time. When we worked in the slave fields, 4 or 5 of us together. When we were sleeping in our bunks or our barracks or in the slave quarters, way more than 2 or 3 of us were together at a time. Now, see, when we just read out this book, the way they identified and talked to each other was in the Hebrew tongue and they sung this song. We also see that In this modern day of age, if you have a couple Filipinos together, one live on the south side of town, the other one live on the north side of town, and so on and so forth, there they could come to job and congregate and speak in their native tongue or speaking English. The same thing goes for Hispanics. The same goes for any other nation. But this nation, again, Selah, it was made illegal to talk in your native tongue. Again, think about that. Now here go these sisters. They're gonna sing Shema Israel in English. And after you hear them sing in English, then you will truly understand that Hebrew man in that book that met those Hebrews, and they end up calling them Indians. That song was sung in the Americas, in the continent of Africa, and Israel itself. One people worshiping Yah in song, and that was made illegal. Alright, the last of Shema Israel.
Blessed be his name, his glorious kingdom reigns forevermore. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. Blessed be his name, his glorious kingdom reigns forevermore. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. Blessed be his name, his glorious kingdom reigns forevermore. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. Blessed be his name, his glorious kingdom reigns forevermore. Baruch Shem Kevod Malkuto Leolam Vayed. Adonai, Yeshua HaMashiach hu Adonai.
Shema Israel. Shema Israel. Yahuwah Elohim. Yahuwah. Hallelujah. Shema Israel. Shema Israel. Yahuwah Elohim. Yahuwah.
Do you ever wonder what made David dance out of his clothes? It's on my heart real heavy.
Okay, we're going to continue with the lost tribes of the promised land. And here we're going to focus from pages 362 to 365. There's a lot of information in this book. We want to make sure we cover it before we move on. The time frame in this timeline that we're dealing with now, you're looking at the 1600s to 1650. We have slavery that officially kicked off in the years 1619. Now, we're dealing with this timeline even earlier than that, and the person that we're going to look at here, and you can find him in the Lost Tribes of the Promised Land, page 362, and the man we're about to talk about is John Locke. They call him the father of liberalism, or quote unquote, a liberal. Now, John Locke, he was an English philosopher, physician. He was widely regarded as the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers and commonly known as the father of liberalism. And some of his quotes that he made at the time: "What worries you, masters? You, no man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience. All mankind, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." So he was in the Carolinas, and he was strictly against the slavery. And again, that he was born and lived 1632 to 1704. And the person we're looking at right now was a Portuguese Morano, and he was named Antonio de Montesinos. This is important because, again, this puts us 20 years or so, or 25 years after they say officially slavery started. And his account tells exactly that those Indians that they came across that spoke Hebrew were actually, as you read in page 365, they called them the children of Israel. So even going back then, when we say slavery had just started and slaves were still coming to this country, the natives, the Indians, were considered Hebrew Israelites, and they spoke that native tongue of Hebrew. We continue, and they called him a Portuguese Morano. And that's important because when we look at Morano, you spell that word, or Marino, Marrano. The Morinos were Spanish and Portuguese Jews living in the Iberian Peninsula who converted or were forced to convert to Christianity during the Middle Ages, yet continued to practice Judaism in secret. Another definition of a Marrano is a Christianized Jew or more, especially one merely professed conversion in order to avoid persecution. So when you look at page 365, it tells you that during the Spanish Inquisition, the brother that we're talking about, the Portuguese Morano, he was actually imprisoned. And then we look at his skin color, and it tells you that he was of Judah, that tribe, or more. And again, we already established what the Moors or what they look like, and now we know what Judah looked like, because again, they were confessed to be the same, or at least look the same, excuse me. And the Indians, when the other people of that area saw them, they said, "These are your people right here." So we have the time frame, we have the people. Now we also want to look at the caste system. And this is important, and this brings us to a more modern time. Because we looked at the 1940s, the Nazis had a caste system, and that caste system that they had, not much different from what America had. But it tells you the bond of persecution and how people still think. So the Nazis had the Aryan pure blood race. And if you weren't of the pure blood, you became lower down the pecking order. The lowest of the lowest, rape, murder, killing, no possessions, no land, that applied. You can still be dead. And we see black people, we still catch hell from the KKK, the Aryan Brotherhood, so on and so forth. So when we hear this brother being called a Marrano, the caste system that existed right there and where the Aryan nation and Nazis got their idea from, as well as America, came from the Spanish. And it was colonial Mexico had a legal racial caste system that was very complex and detailed. It was a legal caste system imposed by the Spanish government, and one's caste determined how high in society one could go. For the sake of argument, the three main races were Peninsulars, who were Europeans, native Indians, and African Negroes. Inside that caste system, they also had different levels of one being a pure blood, or if you're mixed. One of the mixed terms they had was mestizo and mulatto. The mixed race identified among U.S. Hispanics, the term mestizo means mixed in Spanish and generally usually thought of Latin American to describe people mixed in ancestry with a white European in an indigenous background. That's the whites that were mixed with, we would say, the Hispanics and those of that nature. The mulattoes was those mixed with the European races and what they end up calling the African Negro. And the more darker you got, the lower you felt on that race. And again, what America did with their caste system, anyone that was considered Negro, black, mulatto, any drop of Negro blood, they considered you just a slave. So that's the reason why we look at that caste system that America has in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States says if you're black, you're only 3/5 of man. That's where it comes from. That's the fundamental core of that. So now we're going to continue what the Americans had, the first Emancipation Proclamation, and what America, the United States government, called the Seminole Indians at that time. Were they African slaves? Were they Indians? Or were they Hebrews? And again, you're not taking my word for it. We're going to see what the United States government of the United States called them at that time. So with this, let's continue with the timeline. Now, on the timeline, we traveling back, way back to the 1600s to be exact. And now we see this water, all this water going north, south, east, and west. Here we stop in what they call the New World. And let's see what happens in our timeline in the New World. John Smith, the legend of him being saved by Pocahontas. But the real version of what happened you can find in reference of Bredegall Carl, Jamestown, 1544 to 1699. And this is Smith John, the General History of Virginia, New England, and Summer Isles, originally published in 1624 and republished in 1966. This tells the story of Captain John Smith, him in 1596, being age 16, left his home in England and fought against Spain and supported the Dutch independence of the Spanish crown. Won his freedom, came back at 25 years old. Smith, he joined the Virginia Company, had recently been granted a charter by King James I to colonize Virginia. Smith left England December 1606. The voyage lasted roughly 4 months. He dwelled, arriving in Virginia in April 1607. And again, if we look at this timeline, 1607 is 12 years before 1619. Smith was all the leaders of this colony. He was made the president of it. He was soon elected president of the colony. Now, during this colony in Virginia, Smith and his people came across the Indians, were fighting. The Indians that were in conversation with was the Potwan. And the Potwan, when they took him prisoner, at one point wanted to kill him. John Smith's account of what happened was, according to Smith, he thwarted their plans of murdering him by the chief's daughter, Pocahontas. And she was around 11 or 12. She fell in front of him, begging for his life for mercy, and they granted it. Some say it's American folklore. Some don't think it's true. Some think it is. Again, John Smith wrote many articles about his life in the Americas. They call it his personal journals. He talks about being beset by 200 savages, them killing his men, killing him being the prisoner, again, of the Potwan chief. This is the best point that we could read in this reference here. 2 days after the Potwan having disguised himself in most fearless manner he could, caused Captain Smith to be brought forth to a great house in the wood, and there upon a mat by the fire to be left alone. Not long after, found from behind a mat that divided the house was made the most disfluent noise he ever heard. The Potwan, more like a devil than a man, with some 200 more as black as himself, came unto him and told him now that they were friends, and presently he should go to Jamestown to send him 2 great guns and grindstone, for which he would give him the Count of Capashack, and forever esteem him as his own Natawquat. So he describes them black devils. Where we heard that term before. Continuing. Next, we have a reading from the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, October 1944. And this reads, Captain John Smith and the Indians by Keith Glenn, 2nd Lieutenant of Women Army Corps. When in the early years of the 17th century, the Virginia Company of London began to solicit support from an English colony in the New World. They found, among other hindrances to their enterprise, a doubt in the minds of some Englishmen that it was lawful to make plantations in countries inhabited by other people. Insert by me. Who are the other people? By John Smith's account, who they're talking about, the other people were black devil Indians. Again, his report, before the slave trade came off, they were dealing with black people. And these were the people they had trouble colonizing. Continuing with the read. Even though they were heathen, this scruple was straightened by the troubling thought, based on Spanish experience, that colonization was inadvertently attended by oppression and cruelty to the innocent natives. To remove these and other objections, the Virginia Company enlisted the aid of a number of prominent clergymen. John Donne was one of them, who preached sermons afterwards, printed to aid the cause of the Virginia colony. These sermons demonstrated incontrovertibly from the scriptures that plantations in the lands of the heathen people were not only lawful, but had been absolutely commanded by God himself. How else had the Palestines become the home of the chosen people? And how else were Christ's commands to preach the gospel to all nations to be fulfilled and the infidels converted to the true faith. So here we see an article that you see on your screen, and we'll read the end of this. Lieutenant Keith Glenn, prior to the enlistment in the Women's Army Corps, was Research Assistant in the Department of English, Harvard University. Editor. So again, we got the accounts of what was going on to the natives, the Indians in Virginia at that time that were considered black. And they changed the word in the Bible to put that yoke of iron on. Let's continue with descriptions of the Indians when they first came to America. Our next source, Hebrews, comes from the written record of the voyage of 1524 of Giovanni da Veruzan. You can find this at www.columbia.education, image 21, early AC documents Veruzan. Adapted from a translation by Susan Terra of the Killer Codex and Lawrence C. Roth Education. The Voyages of Giovanni de Veruzan, 1524 to 1528. This was in Yale, 1970. You can find this what I'm about to read from page 133 through 143. Veruzan was a navigator who made numerous voyages to the eastern Mediterranean seas, and in 1523 he was invited by King of France to explore an area between Florida and the Tarantino in order to find an all-water route through the newly found Americas to the Pacific Ocean. So he had a mission that he was going to make sailing a little bit easier. That was his goal. This is what he saw, and this is his correspondence that he written back to the King of France. And this is what Europe knew. This is what America knew. This was written in Yale. So let's read what this explorer written to the king, and it goes. They go completely naked, except that around their loins they wear skins of small animals like martens, with a narrow belt of grass around the body, to which they tie various tails of other animals which hang down to the knees. The rest of the body is bare, and so is the head. Some of them wear garlands of bird feathers. They are dark in color, not unlike the Ethiopians, with thick black hair, not very long, tied back behind the head like a small tail. As for the physique of these men, they are well proportioned, of medium height, a little taller than we are. They have broad chests, strong arms, and legs and other parts of the body are well composed. There is nothing else, except that they tend to be rather broad in the face, but not at all, for we see many with angular faces. They have big black eyes, an attentive and open look. They are not very strong, but they have sharp cunning, and are agile and swift runners. From what we could tell from observation, in the last two respects they resemble the Orientals, particularly those from the forest Cenarian regions. So, this is the account that he had. And a little bit earlier in the account, he said he saw numerous of these people when they first landed on the shore. Some fled, some stayed, some watched. But it wasn't just one or two or 100, but numerous, more than he counted. What we read here took place well before 1619, where they say slavery began in America, where the first Negroes were transported in, and that's the beginning and the end of the story. We also see confirmation that there was numerous amount of what they consider black Indians in this country at the time. Now we're going to look at how some of the laws in America took place to make a differentiation between the Negro and the Indian so they could look upon and just be looked at as slaves, to take away their identity. And again, as the word of the Most High says, so you can be considered by a byword and a proverb. A proverb is something you got to figure out. All right, let's go to the Acts 17 and what took place for your identity there. Yod Hey Wah Hey, or Yod Hey Vav Hey. In the background, you'll hear a little bit of what we call Hebrew or Indian music, and that chant will be saying our Creator's name along with Yah. I am going to read Deuteronomy 28, verse 36 and 37. And it reads, Yah shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And there thou shalt serve other Elohim, wood and stone, and thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all the nations where the Yah shall lead thee. Hebrews, I will go to a better understanding and explanation of what I read at the very end of this video. But in the meantime, let's keep it pushing. Hallelujah. Shalom. Wa Mashiach Barakatah. Now we're going to look at did the United States of America cover up and actively cover up the identity of those that could be considered Indians, indigenous to this land, being here in America before there was a creation of the United States of America, before Florida became a state where there's those that was indigenous to the land that were considered no longer aboriginals but became slaves. So to look at this, we're going to go to, it's called Chapter 17 of Acts of the General Assembly of the State of Virginia. In this excerpt of the Acts of the General Assembly of the State of Virginia, published in 1866, the General Assembly defines how Virginians are legally classified as Negro and Indian. Chapter 17, an act to amend and reenact the 9th section of Chapter 103 of the Code of Virginia for 1860, defining a mulatto, providing for the punishment of offenses by colored persons, and for the admission of their evidence in legal investigations, and to repeal all laws in relation to slaves and slavery and for other purposes, passed February 27th, 1866. Number 1, be it enacted by the General Assembly having 1/4 or more of Negro blood shall be deemed a colored person. And every person, not a colored person, having 1/4 or more of Indian blood shall be deemed an Indian. Number 2, all laws in respect to crimes and punishment and in respect to criminal proceedings applicable to white persons shall apply in like manner to colored persons and to Indians unless when it's otherwise specifically provided. So what we read here, and we will continue to see how this actually morphed to all 50 states. Here your identity as being a Negro or a colored person was pushed down to just being a slave. Because they'll tell you, unless you can prove you have quote unquote some Indian blood in you, in which you were indigenous to the land to begin with, you cannot have some of the rights of some of the Indians have as far as the land and taxes and so forth. But they destroyed the records, hid the records for slavery, saying you're just a slave. And then when you went to go fight for your rights, they had laws against you that they already put in place. Now we're going to look at another law that happened a little bit later, but end up affecting all 50 states. So the next one, we're not going to spend much time on. As they say, we're going to hit it and quit it. You're looking at Walter Plecker. And this racist heathen, he's responsible for your census and vital statistics. Him and Margaret Sanger are some of the greatest racists in America. And it wouldn't be so bad if their ideology and their hatred for anything colored or black people or copper colored died with them. But unfortunately, Margaret Sanger's views with Planned Parenthood has transcended her death, and the United States of America has embraced it. Walter Plecker's views have also transcended his death, and again, if you're a part of the census or vital statistics within covering all 50 states, it's from his racist ideology of eugenics that puts that together. And basically, these two heathens are trying to kill anybody of copper colored or skin color from the womb. See Planned Eugenics or Planned Parenthood, as well as what you document for your baby at birth. Also, what you can prove so you can get rights for your family, he makes that almost impossible for you to go to. So it's the way you look, what you can prove. But again, don't take my word for it. Let's listen to the President of the United States and what he thinks people should look like if they're black and or Indian.
Is this you discussing Indian blood? We're going to judge people by whether they have Indian blood, whether they're qualified to run a gaming casino or not?
That probably is me, absolutely. Because I tell you what, if you look at some of the reservations that you've approved, you, sir, in your great wisdom have approved, I will tell you right now, they don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like to Indians. Now, maybe we say politically correct or not politically correct. They don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like Indians to Indians, and a lot of people are laughing at it, and you're telling how tough it is, how rough it is to get approved. Well, you go up to Connecticut, and you look. Now, they don't look like Indians to me, sir.
Thank God that's not the test of whether or not people have rights in this country or not, whether or not they pass your look test.
Depends whether or not you're approving it, sir.
No, it's not a question whether I'm approving it. It's not a question whether I'm approving it. Mr. Trump, you know in the history of this country where we've heard this discussion before, they don't look Jewish to me.
Oh, really?
They don't look Indian to me. They don't look Italian to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a test for whether people could go into business or not go into business, whether they could get a bank loan.
Don't understand why there hasn't been more attention to John Horse and the Black Seminoles, but hopefully we can correct this. John Horse and the Black Seminoles deserve to be remembered for a number of reasons. They created the largest haven in the U.S. South for runaway slaves. They led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. They secured the only emancipation of rebellious slaves prior to the U.S. Civil War, and they formed the largest mass exodus of slaves across the United States, moving from the Florida Everglades through Indian Territory, what would become Oklahoma, eventually locating in Mexico, where they secured title to their own land.
We are entering the last part, and this part is going to be on the Seminole Indians, and we're going to dive right in. In 1687, slaves were brought to Florida from the British colony of Carolina. The following year, the owner of 8 men and 3 women sought to return them to Charleston, but the slaves had converted to Catholicism, the Spanish state religion of King Charles II. Said they would be allowed to stay in Florida. His actions encouraged slaves throughout the South to flee to Florida. So this is in 1687. We're 60 years past them saying that slavery, but remember the accounts that we've already read by the people that got here. In the Carolinas, his description was those of black people. That's what he wrote back to France. In Virginia, even though they said they brought 20 slaves in, we know for a fact there was at least 200 blacks that were already here. So we read the account, and just like it was back in 1493, you were able to be free as long as you bow down to the Catholics or the Roman Catholic Church. And that's what we read here. Continuing, sometime between March and November of 1738, Spanish settlers in Florida formed a town named Garcia Real de Santa Teresa de Mus, 2 miles to the north of St. Augustine. Initially, it consisted of 38 men, all fugitive slaves, most of them married, who had fled to Florida for sanctuary and freedom from enslavement in the Carolinas and Georgia. It came to be known as Fort Muse. So here we see there's a fort, and it's actually a black fort. Some say they're slaves, but again, we read the accounts of them being here already in the Carolinas, as well there's accounts of blacks being here in Florida before Florida was even a state. But let's continue. Most of the pro-British blacks left Florida after British loss and the revolution ended in 1782, but scores remained behind. By the early 1800s, these fugitives were emerging as a district community known as the Maroons and Indian Negro. They were initiating ties to the Florida Indians. Ties would eventually cause them to be known as Seminole Negroes, or today Black Seminoles or Seminole Freemen. Again, another insert. As we look at the word Maroons and the Geechees, today, 2019, August 27th, the Geechees and Maroons are in the islands of the Carolinas, are getting their land taken away from them, even though they can prove it's their ancestral land going back to this time right here. The government has made up laws, and now they're building up, as we would say, vacation spots, golf courses, all you can eat inclusive resorts in these islands. But the blacks are losing their homes through the laws, and again through sellout Negroes as well. That's what's going on today. But yet we got people saying this is something new. Let's continue with the Seminoles. Now, we're at the Indian Removal Act. We hear them being called black slaves, runaway slaves. They're all in Florida. But let's read this Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act was signed into a law May 28, 1830 by the United States President Andrew Jackson. The law authorized the president to negotiate with the Southern Native American tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River. In exchange for white settlements in ancestral lands. The act has been referred to as the Unitary Act of Systematic Genocide because it discriminated against the ethnic group and so far as to make certain the death of vast numbers of its population. The act was signed by Andrew Jackson. It was strongly enforced under his administration and that of the Martin Van Buren. So we see two presidential administrations that put in a removal act. And they said this removal act was for the Indians. Let's continue to see who they were fighting at that present time and how their names kept changing from, as we read in the word of the Most High, by a byword and a proverb. Someday they're Negroes, someday they're Indians, sometimes they're black freedmen, sometimes they're Seminoles. It just depends who was talking. Continuing. December 23rd, 1835 to August 14th, 1842, 6 years, 7 months, 3 weeks, and 1 day. That was the Second Seminole War. The conflict ended with a peace treaty from, we say, the general and one of his fighters. We're going to get specific on the general that we're talking about and the Indian that we're talking about. Because this treaty, or this broker agreement, gentleman's agreement, war agreement, it wasn't honored by the United States, but it got honored by these two men. As they say in Hebrew, Selah. Think about that. Continuing. Now we have the time frame. We know it was a war declared by the United States. We have the Removal Act to start the First Civil War. Let's continue. Now on your screen, you will see an article that was posted back at that time. Negroes in Seminole War. So now we got two names, Negroes in Seminole War. We will skip down to where it says it. And it reads, it is usually referred to as the country's most protected and expensive Indian war. But Major General Thomas Sidney Jessup, who was in command in Florida during its most crucial period, announced emphatically late into 1836, this is a Negro, not an Indian war. Now, some people say he was doing this trying to get more people in the South involved. But again, we will read more articles and more things to show you that they call these Seminoles Negroes. We will also see that the head of the Seminoles, in many of the cases, were out and out black men. By the reports of General Jessup and his army, 1838, when he was fighting John Whitehorse, and Jessup and Whitehorse went back and forth with this agreement that he made. And again, Jessup tried to honor it. In 1838 is when Jessup got wounded and he said, hey, you guys are free. But they were fighting for years. Continuing. Now we're looking at Abraham. Abraham, to Jessup and all the other soldiers that were fighting, he was known as the chief of the chiefs. He was known as the head honcho. He negotiated. He made war strategies. He went inside their things on their tents when they're making agreements and said, man, we whipping y'all tails. I didn't come here to bargain with you. Just give us our freedom. He was known as the chief of chiefs. We will read this, and this says, the fort was attacked and destroyed during the First Civil War, 1817 to 1818. Abraham was one of the few survivors. He made his way to the Swanee River town in Florida. Abraham continued fighting during the First Seminole War. He became known as the Safathi Tukuznaji. Swansea warrior is what that means. He lived in an African town in Florida called Pelawaka, or Many Ponds, and was adopted as a member of the Seminole Nation. He became the prime minister of the Co-Keeper dynasty and chief advisor to the Minnetonka principal, Chief Alaquat Seminole, and later became the chief of all the Seminole. Continuing. And the next one we're going to read about is John Horse, also known as, or what we would say, AKA, Juan Caballo, Juan Cavello, John Conaway, and Gopher John, was a mixed ancestry of African and Seminole Indian who fought alongside the Seminoles in the Second Seminole War in Florida. He rose to prominence in the Third War. John Horse, black man, was one of the leaders. He's the one that had the agreement with Jessup that his people will be free. And we're going to put a little insert of video so you can hear a little bit more about that. But he led his people from Florida, Oklahoma, Texas, and they finally rested in Mexico. Here, this one is called johnhorse.com. 2 quick quotations HTM. And these are a bunch of letters, just like if you read the Bible. The New Testament is made up of what we would call epistles, letters. These are letters dating back to the 1835. And in these letters, they describe the Seminole Indians as Negroes. They decide the Seminole Indians as Indians. They decide them as blacks. They decide them as slaves. Again, as you go through your American history and you think that slavery was just a one-way ticket to just obedience, all these letters on this page you look at will show how hard these people fought. Negroes, Seminole Indians, blacks, freedmen, whatever you want to call them, until the death for their children, for their wives, for freedom. Now, we're going to look at a short video. And this video is going to touch on a couple of things that I talked about. Now we know a little of those that call themselves Indians, those that call themselves Aboriginals, those that call themselves Hebrews. But now I'm going to go to the word of the Most High after this video. And I'm going to show you the difference that all the people that are dark-skinned and black living in America are not all Hebrews, are not all the blood descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We could be cousins, we could be family, but they don't come from that direct line. So let's listen to this video. Then we're going to get quickly into the word of the Most High, and we'll end this.
To John Horse and Wildcat to organize and resist the raids. When Seminole War Chief Dembo Factor was captured, John Horse, Wildcat, and the Creek Council protested the kidnapping and eventually won the release of Dembo Factor. John Horse would travel to Washington, D.C. in 1844 to argue for a separate land grant for the Seminole Indians outside of Creek territory. They were denied, but John Horse was determined to get change for his people. He traveled to Washington, D.C. once again by himself to appeal to General Jessup. He convinced Jessup to visit the Indian Territory for himself. Following Jessup's visit, 2 new facilities were built for the Seminoles outside of Fort Gibson under the protection of the Army. Large numbers of Seminoles moved into the facilities, but they still lived under the threats of raids by the Creeks, whites, and others. Once, John Horse was attacked and shot by what was considered as a Creek assassination attempt. After the attack, John and his family moved back into the walls of the fort. Marcellus and William Duval were 2 white men with connections in Washington, D.C., working to reinstate freed black slaves as chattel slaves. They were working to persuade then-President James Polk to enslave the black Seminoles. General Jessup's granting for the freedom of the black Seminoles was deemed illegal by John Mason and the Seminole Council, and the black Seminoles were once again considered chattel slaves. The Seminoles were forced back into the territory of the fort in Mississippi, and because the free blacks and the Seminoles were considered slaves again, up to 280 of them were kidnapped and re-enslaved. John Horse and Cole Coochie led a protest against the enslavement of blacks and black Seminoles. The 2 men would also lead over 100 blacks into Texas fleeing slavery from 1849 to 1850.
So, we're at the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed this walk with me on the timeline. We took a look at where captivity started, the changing of the Bible started, the reason why we go by so many bywords and proverbs, and were we the Aboriginals, and were we the Indians, and are we the Hebrews? And when this video first started, I did tell you I was coming from a Bible perspective because my faith and my hope is grounded in the Word. I don't want to add to it or take away from it. That means I cannot speak directly to the perspective of other people and their philosophies and their thoughts, because they, in some cases, don't believe the word of the Most High is true. Saying that, I don't comprehend and or understand the extremes of some that do teach. You will have those that want you to believe that there was no such thing as a slave trade. And again, trade has to go back and forth. Just like it is today, that is how it was in the past. So you'll have those that will teach you all the Indians were here. Then you'll have those that teach the word of the Most High. And you got some that's insanity, or what we call Christianity, that came from the Catholic religion, and they will tell you don't worry about who you are anyway. Then you have some that have the knowledge of the Bible but lack understanding, and they will tell you that the 37 million people in the United States that are of color are all Hebrews, even though the word of the Most High say he didn't pick us because we were multi in number. You will also have some of those that would tell you that you don't have to be just black to be a Hebrew. There's Latinos and all those that come inside the umbrella as well. When we look at the word of the Most High, and I'm going to read a scripture, and this comes from Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, I'm going to start at verse 22 and stop at verse 23. And it reads, the children of Shem, Elam and Asher and Arphaxad and Lud and Aram, and the children of Aram, Uz and Ul and Gather and Mishah. So, even if you believe you're a Shemite, and there's 37 million, that means only at least 3 million can be Hebrews if you consider all the Shemites. Because not all of them trace back to the bloodline of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And through all those Shemites, they have children. So that will decrease the number even more. Furthermore, when you read the word of the Most High, it's directed to the children of Israel. The things they went through, the captivity they went through. So the rest of the Shemites or the Hamites or the Japhites, they were not looked upon or constricted like the children of Israel were. When we were in Egypt, there were those that were Shemites that were traveling the world. They didn't have to stay in Egypt with us. When we were in Israel fighting for our land to stay there, being with the Most High, if they did not stay with us, again, they were an unparts unknown. So you don't have to be of the bloodline of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to enter into this covenant. The Most High tells us there is one law for the native born and the stranger. See, I cannot tell you the end game of those that tell you you're more. I don't know the benefit that will come out of it. Do they think somehow over 400 years of captivity plus that if you claim you're more today, it's going to make them look a different way than the way they did in the 1700s or the 1800s? Or if you say you know you're Indian, Is that going to change the laws, statutes, and commandments of the United States of America to give you some bonus or some ease in this captivity? I told you in the video when they marched John Horse's people. You can look at the videos of the Million Man March or some of the times when they said we're having a riot. That is what they would have looked back then. A bunch of Hebrews or Negroes upset with their captivity. Now, if you want to grab hold of this covenant, my first suggestion to you is keep the Sabbath day. See, since I believe in the words of the Most High, if you could take hold of the Sabbath day, you will get to learn the Creator. And maybe you will find out that you don't need to keep listening to some of these theologians, these Catholics, some of these reverends or Negroes. If you read the words of the Most High on the Sabbath day and return back to Him, just maybe you'll be able to ease this captivity you're in. See, the Sabbath day is a day of rest, and the Creator made that rest for you and for me. And you could read the words of the Most High. And if you want to reach out and touch me and talk to me, I'm not going to ask you for a nickel, dime, or quarter. And I'm not going to try to lord over you in this word. I'm not going to try to tell you what to do with your Johnson, what to do with your wife. I'm just going to give you what thus saith the Most High. See, taking hold of this covenant is one law for the stranger as well as the native born. Not only is having the Sabbath day, he tells you there's a dietary law. So you don't need an Atkins diet. You don't need to have all these fly-by-night diets. The Most High created the body. And inside that body, there's finger-like projections in your intestines. And in those intestines, they find sodium, potassium, zinc, whatever the electrolytes your body needs to keep you going and safe. You see, the others will tell you there is no more dietary law. But in order for you to get those type of nutrients, you need a magnifying glass to see what's inside of a banana or a pineapple or a beet and how that helps you. Your body does it naturally. And the Bible tells those that are Hebrew Israelites what things they should be eating to enhance that. See, it also talks about the captivity that we are in right now. In some of the cases, we'll hear how they got betrayed by this Negro and that Negro. The Most High tells you to separate yourselves from the nation. Once you've turned back to Him, He will help you in your walk, in the way you think, and the what you want to buy and what you're going to party with. He doesn't tell you not to feast and not to celebrate. He just tells you to do those things with Him. Don't forget to feast and celebrate and not thank the Creator. So if you want to take this walk and learn the ways of the Most High, again, I'm here to help you. I can't help you on being the best Indian you could be or being the best Moor you can be. But I can help you trying to find the Most High. So with this, I say Shalom, all praises, Yod, Hey, Wah, Hey, Ani, Haya, Ashar, Ani, Haya, or plainly saying Yah, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I do hope those that labor in the word, as well as those that's trying to help brothers and sisters live on this planet, I bid you peace. And I hope you find what you're searching for. Okay. With that being said, hallelujah. Shalom. Mishpah. Israel.
Muskogee war chant, a Hebrew Indian war chant, a Creole war chant. You have so many names that people call us, but we want to demonstrate. Hey, Yahweh, hey, Yahweh, hey, Yahweh, hey, Yahweh, hey. means Yahweh lives. Assalamu alaikum wa shalom alaikum likoli hadbiaka halidat Israel. Indian war chant. Done know.